So why exactly are priests and nuns celibate?
Right. It's a huge question.
I mean, we usually just assume it's a divine mandate, right? Like a golden rule just handed down from the sky.
Yeah, a purely spiritual requirement to show your devotion.
Exactly. But, well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a perspective that completely rips up that assumption.
It really does.
We're examining an incredibly thought-provoking lecture that was given in Gyeongju, South Korea, in March of 2026. And it looks past all the theology to uncover something much more grounded.
Yeah, the lecture actually frames this as question 22 in a broader series, and they call it the forgotten question.
Right.
And the whole premise is that to understand these vows, whether we're talking about Catholicism or Buddhism,
Yeah.
we have to stop looking at them as these supernatural decrees.
Because they aren't.
No, the rule of celibacy wasn't just dropped from the heavens. It is a highly calculated, deliberately engineered organizational construct.
Which is wild to think about, because when you look closely at the history and the mechanics of these institutions, there's no actual, biological or divine law that prevents a person from having a family while also serving a community.
None at all.
The institution created the restriction to solve a very specific, undeniable problem of human nature, because the ultimate goal of these organizations is to elevate certain individuals into holy figures, right?
Yeah, they're trying to create living, breathing archetypes of purity and selflessness.
Yeah, mirroring figures like Mary or Jesus. But creating a selfless leader runs directly into a brick wall of biology.
It does. And the lecture distills that biological brick wall into this brilliant phrase, the arm bends inward.
I love that phrase.
It's so good, right? It's an inescapable reality of human psychology and evolutionary biology. I mean, if you have a child or a spouse, your natural, overpowering instinct is to prioritize them.
Of course.
You will instinctively channel your resources, your emotional energy, your physical protection, all your time inward, toward your own bloodline.
Which is, the fundamental definition of a good parent.
Right.
If we were talking about everyday life, prioritizing your family is exactly what society expects you to do. But if your entire job description is to serve the masses, to be completely objective, universally available, and fundamentally impartial, that natural parental instinct transforms into a massive organizational liability.
It's a huge liability.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you think about how this plays out in the modern world, it is essentially an ancient, extreme version of a corporate conflict of interest policy.
Oh, that corporate parallel is incredibly accurate. I mean, modern institutions struggle with this constantly.
Right. So take a CEO of a publicly traded company. If that CEO's children own the supply chain companies that the corporation buys its raw materials from.
Huge red flag.
Massive. That CEO is fundamentally compromised. They cannot make objective decisions for the shareholders because the biological pull to enrich their own family will always be there, either consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah.
The SEC has endless regulations to prevent exactly this kind of nepotism and resource hoarding. But ancient monasteries and religious orders didn't have the SEC.
No, they didn't.
They had the vow of celibacy.
Does the source view this rule as a spiritual necessity or just like an extreme form of human resource management?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source views it as a necessary structural tool for leadership. They recognize that you cannot regulate the human heart through half measures.
You just can't.
Right. The lecture brings up the concept of the presidency to illustrate this on a macro scale. To be a true leader of a nation, or a true spiritual guide for a massive flock, you have to view the entire population as your family.
You have to be what the source translates as the fertilizer for the people.
Exactly. And fertilizer is finite.
Yeah.
If you are pouring all your nutrients into your own private backyard to make sure your own family's garden flourishes, well, the broader fields you are supposed to be tending are going to wither. The organizational logic is ruthless, but it's sound. The institution needs leaders who are 100% dedicated to the community.
Right.
So to ensure that level of dedication, they structurally eliminate the one thing that would organically override it. They demand the severing of blood ties. You have to belong to everyone, which means you cannot belong to anyone in particular.
That's the core of it.
But, if the institution's strategy is to engineer these perfectly objective, unattached leaders, you would naturally assume their recruitment process reflects that.
You'd think so, yeah.
You would expect them to exclusively admit individuals who have never known worldly attachment, like young, idealistic people stepping into the cloister with pristine, unbroken devotion.
But the reality on the ground, as detailed in the lecture, reveals a much messier demographic.
Oh, very messy.
The ranks of these religious orders are not exclusively filled with people who have lived entirely sheltered lives. Many of the individuals stepping into Catholic and Buddhist orders are people who have lived deeply secular, often really complicated lives.
Yeah, the lecture specifically highlights the dulcing demographic.
Right, the Korean term.
Yeah, a term for people returning to the single life after divorce. These are individuals who have been married. Many of them have children.
That live full secular lives.
Exactly. They have experienced the exact biological and emotional attachments that the institution views as a liability.
And their motivation for entering the monastery is rarely a sudden burst of pure, unadulterated religious ecstasy.
Yeah.
They're entering because the secular world broke them. Their regular lives became chaotic, exhausting, or just unbearably painful.
Yeah.
The lecture captures their mindset with a chillingly stark phrase, "I'd rather do this than die."
Here's where it gets really interesting there. This feels like a massive structural paradox.
How so?
Well, the institution creates an incredibly rigid rule of celibacy because they demand flawlessly objective, energetic leaders to guide the masses.
Right.
Yet, their applicant pool is heavily populated by people who are essentially fleeing from their own secular exhaustion. They aren't running toward enlightenment, they're running away from failure or fatigue.
Yeah, it's a profound contradiction.
Isn't there a massive contradiction here? How does a system reconcile demanding a perfect leader from someone who is just desperate for a place to hide?
That is exactly the right question to ask. The organization views itself as a hospital and a training ground. From their perspective, a broken person isn't necessarily a disqualified person, provided they are willing to undergo a radical transformation.
Okay, so it's conditional.
Highly conditional. The institution offers a very clear transaction. They provide sanctuary, quiet, structure, and a new purpose. But the price of admission is absolute.
You have to pay up.
You have to drop your past entirely. They must leave their baggage, their history, and their worldly ties at the door.
The sanctuary requires a toll, and the toll is your former identity. Which, on paper, that sounds like a clean break.
On paper, sure.
But stripping away someone's past isn't as simple as changing their clothes or shaving their head. And that brings up the most compelling dynamic in this entire analysis. What happens when the initial crisis fades?
Right, because dropping your past is a monumental psychological task, and it's where the system experiences its highest failure rate.
Yeah.
The lecture diagnoses the root cause of this failure with absolute clarity. The organizations enforce the rule of celibacy dogmatically rather than philosophically.
They just hand out the rule book and demand compliance without ensuring any real comprehension.
Exactly. You must be pure, you must not marry. But they completely bypass the deep logical reasoning behind the sacrifice.
And without a profound understanding of why the vow is a necessary structural tool for leadership, the individual just relies entirely on willpower.
I mean, power's flimsy.
Extremely. It's highly dependent on an individual's emotional state, which is subject to a very predictable cycle.
Right. When a person first enters the retreat or the monastery, willpower isn't actually the main driver, desperation is.
Yeah.
They are exhausted. They have been beaten down by life. When you are operating in survival mode, letting go of worldly desires is surprisingly easy because your brain only has the bandwidth to seek safety.
You aren't mourning the loss of a complex secular life when your primary focus is just finding a quiet place to breathe. The institutional isolation feels like a relief, not a restriction.
It's exactly like that.
It's remarkably similar to human behavior following a major medical crisis. Think about it. If a person suffers a severe heart attack, they wake up in the hospital absolutely terrified.
Right, they think they're dying.
Exactly. The doctor stands over the bed and says, if you want to live, you can never eat a burger again, only vegetables.
And they agree immediately.
Instantly. In that moment of sheer terror, giving up junk food requires zero effort. The fear does all the heavy lifting. The patient gladly accepts the radical new diet. But the hospital isn't a permanent state of emergency.
No, eventually the healing process begins. And inside the organization, these exhausted individuals are given regular meals. They are given a safe place to sleep. They are entirely shielded from the financial and social brutalism of the outside world. And as the lecture vividly describes it, fat builds in their bellies.
They get comfortable, the color returns to their cheeks, the survival instinct that made the vows easy to swallow finally switches off.
And that is exactly when the crisis begins.
Right. Because 6 months after the heart attack, when you feel healthy again, the terror is gone. And suddenly, the craving for the burger comes back with a terrifying intensity.
What's fascinating here is that the belly fat metaphor is so crucial. It isn't just about physical weight or returning health. It represents psychological complacency.
Complacency is the real danger.
Exactly. Once the raw desperation fades, the silence of the cloister stops being a relief and starts becoming an echo chamber. Their minds begin to wander back over the walls.
Yeah.
They start thinking about the children they left behind, the romantic desires they renounced, the life they could be living now that they have their energy back.
Because the underlying human desires were never actually resolved. They were merely suppressed by the sheer trauma of whatever drove the person into the monastery in the first place.
Right, the institution provided a physical sanctuary, but failed to provide the necessary psychological roadmap to process those returning desires.
The lecture argues that true behavioral transformation, what we might call genuine enlightenment, requires a profound internal shift in understanding.
A total paradigm shift.
Yeah. If an individual is simply white-knuckling their way through a vow because of an institutional mandate, the raw human nature underneath will inevitably bubble back up once they get comfortable.
And then they end up trapped in this agonizing limbo. They hold the institutional title of a holy leader, they wear the robes, they live in the protected environment.
But internally, they're suffering.
Yes. Internally, they're battling the exact same biological and emotional attachments as the secular masses they're supposed to be guiding.
This cycle of suppression and returning cravings is so widespread that the lecture makes a sweeping, provocative claim.
It really is a bold claim.
It says that because of this systemic failure to provide true philosophical training, humanity currently lacks truly enlightened leaders.
The institution successfully built a structural hack to force impartiality, but they completely neglected the human engineering required to sustain it.
Yeah.
They built a system that demands perfection, but populated it with people who were never taught how to navigate their own recovery.
It is a profound critique of how we design systems, but I think it's vital to clarify the intent behind this analysis.
Absolutely.
The lecture explicitly states that the goal here is not to criticize or attack religion. This isn't an exercise in pointing out hypocrisy or tearing down faith.
No, not at all. Acknowledging this reality isn't about taking sides or passing judgment on the people struggling inside these monasteries.
Right. We are looking at these massive ancient structures as the ultimate historical case studies in human organization. They are laboratories where the collision between institutional goals and human biology has been playing out for centuries.
Exactly. The lecture specifically points to modern society, using South Korea as a prime example, arguing that we desperately need to develop the ability to impartially dissect these legacy organizations.
We are surrounded by institutions, religious, governmental, corporate, that run on ancient, rigid rules.
And society often falls into a binary trap when dealing with legacy institutions.
Yeah.
We either blindly revere their rules because that's the way it has always been done, assuming some unassailable wisdom,
Right.
or we cynically dismiss them as entirely corrupt. This analysis forces us onto a third path, becoming impartial observers.
So what does this all mean for you? Think about the organizations you interact with on a daily basis. The corporate hierarchy at your workplace, the structure of your local government, the community boards you sit on.
They all have these structures.
Every single one of those systems has rules designed to manage human nature, to prevent the arm from bending inward. But how many of those systems are just relying on dogmatic enforcement?
Probably most of them.
Are you blindly accepting their rules, or are you looking at the underlying mechanics? How many are promoting people who are just white-knuckling their way through the requirements, building up their own metaphorical belly fat, without ever truly understanding the purpose of their role?
Dissecting these systems isn't just an academic exercise. It is the only way we can figure out how to organize our own modern societal structures more effectively.
Yeah.
If we understand why the monastery fails to create a perfectly objective leader, we can better understand why a corporate board or a political cabinet fails to remain impartial.
So true. We started this deep dive with a seemingly simple historical question about why priests and nuns are celibate.
Right.
We completely bypassed the standard theological answers and uncovered a ruthless organizational strategy, a structural mechanism designed to create impartial leaders by severing the biological ties that force human beings to hoard resources for their own families.
And we examined the stark reality of the recruitment pool. We acknowledge that many who seek this ultimate purity are actually refugees fleeing secular exhaustion.
Yeah.
They're utilizing the monastery as a survival mechanism rather than a path to immediate enlightenment.
And we broke down the psychological trap of complacency. The realization that sacrificing your past is incredibly easy when you have nothing left to lose, but sustaining that sacrifice once the trauma heals and the belly fat returns requires a depth of understanding that dogmatic institutions rarely provide.
It is a brilliant illustration of what happens when you try to solve a biological problem with an administrative rule.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Well, this is a good one.
The central premise of the lecture suggests that to truly serve humanity, to be a pure, objective leader, you have to completely sever your personal attachments.
Right.
You have to ensure your arm never bends inward so that you can be the fertilizer for everyone. But given the undeniable gravitational pull of human biology and the agonizing internal return of cravings once the belly fat builds is true, completely unbiased leadership actually possible for human beings?
It's a tough question.
Or are we ultimately designing organizational systems that demand a perfection that humans, by our very nature, simply cannot sustain? Keep looking at the blueprints.